IDC International Radio, 106.2 FM, from Israel to the world.
Herzliya Conference. Special interviews, highlights, and live broadcasts on IDC Radio.
Hi, welcome to 106.2 FM, IDC International Radio. You're listening to me, Sabrina Zeloof, for the Herzliya Conference Special. With me in the studio now is Danielle Pletka, who is the Senior Vice President for Foreign Defense Policy Studies at the American Enterprise Institute, which is a Washington think tank. So welcome to the studio, Danielle.
Thanks very much.
Thank you for being here. This conference is coming at quite a tense time, I would say, in the world. But in general, I mean, you've spent quite a lot of focus on the Middle East during your career. What would you say? Is your take on the current situation? Is this are things escalating much different to how they were, let's say, 10, 15 years ago, or is it just a cycle?
Well, the Middle East is a gift that keeps on giving for those of us who've devoted our lives to its study. There's always a tense moment. Things are rarely getting better. They're usually getting worse. And it's important to bring some perspective. You know, for Israel, things are not perhaps as bad as they have been historically. In fact, I would say that the realignments that are going on now in the Middle East are more favorable to Israel than perhaps they were a couple of years ago. But in terms of the swirl of events, the number of forces at play in places like Syria, in places like Libya, the trouble that we have in the Gulf, in Yemen, between Saudi Arabia and Qatar, the challenges in Egypt, the refugee flows, Lebanon, Jordan. I mean, we could go on and on and on. So where for Israel things may be getting better, in the region as a whole, I would say that things are getting worse.
But I mean, the argument would go that the deterioration of the area will eventually affect Israel negatively. You know,
it's interesting because Israel has in some ways become much more a part of the area over the last 50, 60 years, but it has been insulated in many ways from the problems of the area. And the truth is that the lesson that you learn is that democracy and democratic capitalism are huge resources that stabilize a country and that give it a cushion against external forces. Obviously, Israel has great military capacity as well, but at the end of the day, what makes the country successful, what makes it stand out in the region is two things. One, it's democratic capitalism, and second of all, it's institutions, which are really resilient.
Okay, but speaking about democratic capitalism, that can't exactly be applied throughout the whole region with such ease.
That's why Israel is unique. In fact, there is not another country like that in the region, and this is why you see that the fortunes of countries, even countries as rich as Saudi Arabia, rise and fall with oil prices, with global disruptions, and that's why Israel is unique.
Okay. Now tell us a bit about your work for the U.S. Senate Committee on Foreign Relations. Could you predict the instability that we see today?
Well, all of us are extraordinarily clever and prescient in hindsight, although none of us as clever and as prescient as our intelligence communities, both in the United States and in Israel. But I think the honest answer is that the issues that concerned us when I was in the Senate, which is a decade and a half ago, the issues that preoccupied us were the rise in dictatorship, the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, and the unbridled growth of terrorism. So from that standpoint,
you saw that coming.
Well, I think everybody saw that coming. The only question was how
deal with it,
how prevalent it was going to be, and how much of a threat it was to our interests.
So, what lessons can be learnt from the U.S. foreign policy at the time of the Bush administration?
Well, we learned a lot of good lessons during the Bush administration, and actually, when I say learned, that's the wrong word. There were a lot of good lessons to be learned during the Bush administration. I don't think they have been learned by successive administrations, certainly not by the Obama administration. One of the lessons learned is if you want to deal with a threat that you perceive to our national interests and to the national interests of our allies, you do actually need to have a strategy that is more than eliminating the threat. To put it in the vernacular, you can't beat something with nothing. And that is, for me, the prime lesson of the Iraq War is, great, let's get rid of Saddam Hussein. Saddam Hussein is a dangerous guy. He's a menace to our allies in the Gulf. He's a menace to us, and he proliferates weapons of mass destruction. Okay, fair enough.
And now what?
But who do you want instead? How are they going to govern? What do you want in place? And without those plans, what you end up with is chaotic. This is the lesson that should have been applied to Libya and wasn't by the Obama administration. And this is the lesson that needs to be applied to Syria. It's not that we want Bashar al-Assad. It's not that we want ISIS. It's not that we want Jabhat al-Nusra. It's not that we want anyone in particular. We just want, we have things we don't want.
Right.
That is not what will get you places. And that's why you see the mess that is a series of tactics without a strategy coming from almost everybody except for the Iranians.
But arguably, the strategy is kind of like stalling to see who, could remain in power in terms of who has enough support, and also who is the least of an enemy to the American interest. So at the moment, as you said, it doesn't necessarily, probably can't be ISIS, probably can't be Assad, probably can't be al-Nusra. So who's it going to be?
Well, that is a fine policy for the state of Israel. Israel is a regional player with different interests than the United States. For the United States, the notion that we should sit back and wait to see who turns up is really not acceptable. It's not the way U.S. foreign policy has been run. It's not the way U.S. foreign policy should be run. Either we have interests there, in which case we have an interest in the outcome, in which case we have an interest in a particular outcome, or we don't have interests. The position of the Obama administration was, we don't have interests. Who cares? Let them all kill each other. 500,000 dead, so what? Didn't lose a single soldier. That was sort of the president's attitude, and he said so, and his allies said so. But in fact, I think the American people recognize that this ignored will represent a major threat to our interests and major disruption. Look how it has disrupted what's happened in Europe already, just with refugees. But you can go closer. Europe, Lebanon, Turkey, Jordan. We could talk for ages about the impact. But the idea of passively sitting by and seeing who's on top is not acceptable, because in fact that contemplates the notion that people who are anathema to us will be on top. Somebody potentially worse than Assad. We have an interest in figuring out who and then helping them. We are doing that to a certain extent, and we have now stepped up our help to a variety of factions in Syria. The problem is it doesn't seem clear that it is with a particular view to a particular end. I want so-and-so to win. There should be a government in exile in this place or in that place. We will back you this way. Here's what our constitution is going to look like in the future. Minorities will be protected, secular, da-da-da-da-da. All of those things kind of hang out there as maybe, maybe not.
But if you were now advising President Trump, who would you tell him to put his cards on, to bet his cards on?
Oh, well, that's a nice question. If I were now advising President Trump, I would be a very frustrated woman, like many of his actual advisors. Look, I don't think there's a person. I think there are coalitions of groups, the Syrian Democratic Forces, but this is fraught with risk. If we choose to back solely a Kurdish group as we have with the PYGs, then what we will see is
a backlash.
A backlash from the Sunni. Okay, now who are the Sunni? Well, among others, the Sunnis are ISIS and Al-Qaeda. You want to get rid of them, you want to kill them, but you also want to give them no oxygen, no reason to come back. And that's why this Kurdish first strategy has many risks. What we need is a group of Sunni forces. Now there is a Syrian government, sort of pseudo government in exile, but we have not really stood behind them in any serious way. We need to actually pick sides and then help those people.
Okay, so it seems like you've got a clear idea of that there needs to be strategy in place, and this has been super interesting, but unfortunately our time is already up. But thank you so much for sharing your insights, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.
I'm sure I will. Thanks for having me.
Pleasure. Bye.